Welcome to the Living in Alignment podcast. My name is Amy Landry. Through a collage of conversations, here we distill mindful living and timeless wisdom within a modern, everyday context. Thank you for being here. More than 20 years ago, Daniel Simpson quit his job as a foreign correspondent for the New York Times. It's a long story, and it wound up as a book, but to keep it brief, he got high and freaked out while his colleagues hyped a bogus case for war. Daniel Simpson is the author of The Truth of Yoga, an accessible guide to yoga history and philosophy. He holds a master's degree in yoga studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. And Daniel also teaches courses at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, on yoga teacher trainings, and via his website, truthofyoga.com. Daniel, welcome to the podcast. It is such an honour to have you, so I really appreciate your time. Welcome.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's an honour.
I'd actually love to start our conversation today with a very short story for you, just how I came across you and your work. It actually came to be that I one day went into our local library here in Australia, and I was picking up a book for our son, and I guess the librarians had chosen your book to put on the display shelf for suggested reading on that particular day. And the cover really caught my eye, and I thought that was really special. And I picked it up, I took it home, and I want to emphasize that it is actually the first book that I've ever loaned from the library that I had to go out and purchase. So I hadn't even got a quarter of the way into the book, and I knew that I had to own this book and that it was going to be a really, really important read for me, both as a practitioner and a teacher. And so I want to start our conversation today by giving you a plug, because a huge bravo. It's an excellent book that is so digestible for the average student and practitioner, whilst it incorporates a lot of academic research, which can be very intimidating for many people. And so I bought the book, and I just want to emphasize before we carry on here is that if you are listening to this conversation, whether you are a student and or a teacher, or if you're a teacher trainer, or even if you have books on the shelf at your studio that you sell, I absolutely recommend getting your book, which is titled The Truth of Yoga. So congratulations on such a huge accomplishment.
Well, thank you so much for that really warm and heartwarming introduction. I had no idea that my book was on Australian library shelves, let alone that it might have that immediate impact on you without you knowing anything about it. So I'm really pleased with the job that the publisher did in commissioning a good cover design. I had to reject a couple to get to that one, but it does speak in a way, in the language I was trying to communicate the rest of the ideas in. There's something modern about the design. It's easy on the eye, and yet there's some subtle symbolism in there that goes back to traditional yoga. And my whole approach really, kind of draws on two strands. One is that I have studied academically, these rather complicated topics. But, I'm first and foremost a practitioner, and I'm also, well-versed, I suppose, in the complexity from that perspective. As a practitioner, you start asking people for guidance on yoga philosophy, and what they say often, goes either over your head or contradicts what you heard last time you asked those questions. So it's a bamboozling topic, but it does come from this wonderful Indian heritage. And sometimes, the storytelling in India elucidates everything and distills it down to simple clarity, and other times it gets you lost in the maze. So I wanted to draw on, the sort of two different poles of instruction that I've been exposed to, the Indian tradition and the Western scholarly, I suppose, analysis of those traditions, but to make both of those things fit together in a really seamless way that just makes sense to an ordinary person who wants straightforward answers.
And that's of such great value, and it's actually something I wanted to lightly touch on in our chat. So I'm grateful that you brought that up, because I distinctly recall reading in Christopher Wallace's book Tantra Illuminated, how he talks about how he really believes in the value of coming from an academic viewpoint, but also that experiential perspective, and how, of course, when you're coming from an academic perspective, you have to, I guess, retain as much objectivity as possible, especially like when you're decoding manuscripts and things like that. But then also there's so much value in that experiential aspect, which is very much really what the yoga tradition was founded on. It wasn't founded on the intellect, but through tangible experience. But I'd love to sort of tie this in a little bit, if you wouldn't mind delving in a little bit into your background and your personal story, particularly as it pertains to your path of yoga. And personally, I'd be really curious to know as to how you came to this desire or mission of writing the book, and how that also unfolded.
Well, that's a very long story and could colonize the whole podcast if we're not careful. So I'll try and give you the shortest possible version. I mean, the book itself grew out of my teaching, which was often dealing with people asking questions that, were not easy to answer. And a lot of that was being done online for the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, where I taught a course entitled Philosophy of Yoga. So it was basically the history of yoga through the prism of the major yoga texts. And I realized that, a lot of these answers I was putting together on their discussion forums were worth, recycling. And so it's not that I just stitched them together and made a book. I started to think about what it was I was doing in presenting that information, and, really wanted to come up with the curriculum that I wished I'd been able to study when I was training to be a yoga teacher, and also when I started asking my yoga teachers questions about history and philosophy. So that was its real sort of birth point. And also the fact that there was nothing like it out there. There were lots of academic works that had appeared in the last 20 years that are really insightful, and I wanted to draw on them, but they're very difficult to read if you haven't got some academic training or a kind of yoga nerdy tendency. They're very densely written, they're full of footnotes, and they assume a lot of knowledge. And then, on the other hand, there's a lot of popular yoga literature that's actually misleading, and it doesn't actually tell us the truth of yoga, although it tells us lots of things we'd like to hear. And the first truth of yoga, I should just emphasize, is that there isn't one truth. There are many different versions, which we can get onto a bit later. So all of that, was the foundation for writing the book. But I think the most important ingredient in it is that I used to be a journalist. Once upon a time, I was a foreign correspondent, and it's that training of being thrown in the deep end, with a limited amount of knowledge, but living in another country where you might not speak the language very well, you might not grasp the culture as subtly as somebody who's grown up there, and you're tasked with putting together informative and insightful analysis that will appear in a serious, august publication read by opinion formers, and they depend on that being reliable. I can go off on another tangent here about how that's not the way that the media works in practice, which is why I quit my job, which we can get to in a moment, because I think that is important. But that basic training, the ability to distill lots of complex information and produce, an insightful summary is really what I bring into the process of marrying a bit of that exposure to academic training, a bit of the exposure to scholarly findings, a bit of the exposure to Indian storytelling, and then just my own love of yoga and wanting to explain things. But I got into yoga really by accident, I suppose. I went to India as a backpacker before I started my career as a journalist, and was wandering in the Himalayas and stumbled on a few classes. Did a little bit of, I guess what we would nowadays call yoga asana rather than yoga. I was throwing my body around, had no idea why I was doing it, what was going on. I'd bought a copy of Light on Yoga from a bookstall in Connaught Place in Delhi. I had no idea what to make of it. It stayed in my backpack for most of the trip. The thing I got more into was Tibetan Buddhist meditation sessions. So I dabbled in a bit of that. But to be honest, the main thing I dabbled in was getting really stoned. And I discovered that there were these dreadlocked, half-naked characters who sat around fires who were regarded as holy men, who seemed to have one practice, which was to stay awake all the time smoking hash. And I found that fascinating. I got very confused by that experience. I also went back to India shortly afterwards to the Kumbh Mela, the biggest gathering of people on the planet, at the confluence of the Ganges and the Yamuna rivers in northern India, where a lot of these characters really are somewhat larger than life. are really the center of attention. And, the main bathing days in the river, they lead the stampede before sunrise into the water. And, a lot of them are high all the time. And I was just baffled by this. To me, it was very appealing as a 20-something stoner. But it gave me completely the wrong idea of what yoga was. People said these characters were yogis, but I wasn't sure how that related to the book Light on Yoga that I still hadn't really opened very much. I got really into, I guess, the idea that I could somehow embody some of what I'd seen at that festival by trying to do something similar in the Western world. And when I got very disillusioned as a journalist, I was working for the New York Times. I was stationed in the Balkans, and it was just after the September 11th terrorist attacks. The American public had no interest in anything other than the war on terrorism. And they certainly had no interest in somebody who didn't have a lot of credentials telling them that the invasion of Iraq was based on bogus information that they were publishing on the front page of their newspaper. So I just, smoked more dope, went off the rails, decided to organize a music festival in Belgrade, where there are also two rivers that come together. At the meeting point of the River Danube and the River Sava, there is an island which is named Big War Island. And I thought, what better place to try and channel all that Kumbh Mela energy into a peace festival, a summer of love in the Balkans. That was my crazy fantasy. And the short story of that is it all went horribly wrong, got robbed by local gangsters. And I came back to the UK unemployed, confused, with a bit of a heavy cannabis habit, and didn't know what to do with my life. And somebody said, have you tried yoga? And that was when I actually started going regularly to a yoga asana class, realized that I got completely the wrong end of the stick about yoga philosophy. That although I had spent quite a bit of time hanging out with these characters who probably are the closest living relatives to ancient renouncer yogis, I perhaps hadn't really understood what they were doing. And I couldn't really make sense of the distinction between the asana class and the world of Indian renouncers for another 10 or so years, until I ended up going back to university and studying academically the connections between these worlds. But I did have a deep sense that there was something that I'd encountered in India that was alive and that I had experienced, and whether or not it was through getting stoned or through meditating, there was a shift in my perspective that felt transformative and that felt helpful. And it helped me out of the hole I dug myself into in my late 20s. And the last 20 odd years, I've been, a yoga devotee. It's been my main interest. For a while, it was something I just did as a practitioner and wanted more time for. And then eventually I just quit my job, put my stuff into storage, and basically hung out in India as a yoga bum. And it was that experience that led me to university to do a master's degree, which gave me the, I suppose, credentials and the sense of, a desire to share what I'd learned with others that brought me into teaching. So my attempt to be short in the answer got a bit longer, but hopefully that gives you some indication.
Yeah, it's so interesting as an observer, really listening to your story and how you've sort of reconciled all your experiences, and, the compound of all those experiences has evidently brought you very clearly to doing the work you're doing today, and specifically in terms of your book and your online courses and trainings and so forth. So let's dive into, I guess, the main theme of our chat today, and that is, playing on the title of your book, The Truth of Yoga. And as you noted, there's no one truth of yoga, which is the first thing to, I guess, really highlight here, and that will lead us into our chat. But let's unpack some of the untruths of yoga. And there is a number of them. And as we mentioned at the start of this, before we started recording, that each of them could probably expand into a whole podcast episode.
Absolutely.
But perhaps we could talk about initially, I'll just throw some prompts your way, but maybe something that might be fairly somewhat concise to start with would be the meaning of yoga, because everybody says it means union, and well, that means lots of things, of course, depending on the text and the tradition, and sometimes it means the opposite. So would you like to unpack that for the listener? Because we commonly get told it's union, that's what yoga means, and that's not quite right necessarily.
Well, indeed, it's only really been associated with what we now think of as yoga, particularly, especially when we think about physical practice, since the evolution of physical practices. One of the earliest texts that talks about yoga as the union of the individual self and the supreme, which is the commonly understood sense of what's being united in that way. That's barely 1,000 years old, and yoga's certainly been around for 2,500 years, and maybe much longer than that. But we just have no way of proving it, and it's a mystery, really. And the word yoga, however, was used long before we've got any evidence of what we think of as yoga practices existing. So the earliest surviving Indian texts, the Vedas, they do use the word yoga, but not to mean meditation or to mean necessarily anything to do with what we might call spiritual practice these days. Although that's its own can of worms, because the spirit is timeless and inactive and beyond the perceivable world in some ways, and at the same time immanent within it. And all of the realm in which we do stuff is in the material, in the body, in the mind. So it's not really spiritual practice. It's revealing the spirit through doing things with the material world is the basic yoga premise, certainly in the best known text about yoga philosophy, the Yoga Sutra. And that, which is written by Patanjali and said to be the father of yoga and all good things, definitely does not say that yoga means union. It actually says that union is the problem that yoga resolves. The union between this inanimate witness, the true self, the Purusha in the technical language of Sankhya philosophy, and the perceivable world, which includes the workings of the mind and the body and the senses and everything out there, which is known as Prakriti. And the problem is that this kind of entanglement of the two things in the mind of the practitioner is the source of all confusion. And the answer is to understand that those things don't belong together, should never have been entangled, and need to be disentangled through the practice of yoga, and their eternal separation is the ultimate goal. So Patanjali definitely teaches a yoga of separation, not a yoga of union. But in the modern world, people like to say yoga means union, and it comes from Patanjali. So right there, right at the beginning, some of the first two things you'll ever hear at a yoga teacher training, you've got an irreconcilable contradiction in terms. And we need to, I guess, look at other ways in which the word yoga can be understood. It does come from a verbal root in the Sanskrit language of ancient India, which means to join things together, yuj. And that's the source of, I guess, etymologically, if we're looking at where English comes from, the English word yoke, which has a similar meaning and sounds very similar to yoga. And there are contexts in which that verb yuj is used to mean yoked. So the yoking of the mind is part of what's described in the earliest Vedic texts, talking about how the ancient seers who channeled these hymns of praise to deities, and that's what the earliest Vedas are talking about, were yoking their minds to some sort of cosmic source to be able to get the inspiration for the verses that are then recited as part of Vedic ritual. And the word yoga pops up in that ritual to mean the joining together of usually a chariot and an animal, and particularly for the purpose of going to war, which is definitely not what most people today think of as yogic, what with the promotion of non-harming. That all comes along quite a bit later. Yoga itself doesn't really come from the early Vedic texts, another thing that people like to suggest. But what is there implicit in that idea of yoking the mind is concentration. And there is actually another verb formed from the same root, yuj, that means to concentrate. It means yoking in the sense of what is called samadhi. And samadhi is deep concentration. Samadhi is also a state that arises through deep concentration. It can also mean many other things in itself. Sanskrit is a really complicated language where the meanings of words are dependent on context. They can have, completely opposite meanings. And yoga is a perfect example of that. A word that means one thing and yet the other thing that's completely contradictory. And over the history of yoga, there are so many different things that have been given this name yoga that they can't possibly be reconciled. And some scholars would therefore suggest that it's actually impossible to define yoga. I don't think that's really true. I think that's, just a little bit of an egghead's cop-out, because in the end, there are traditions in which yoga is practiced that share quite a lot of common principles. They don't all share the idea of union, But there is, in some way, a connection being made through yoga practice, even if it's only you know, between the mind and its object of focus. So some sense of concentrating, some sense of connecting through concentrating is there at the bedrock of most things that have got yoga associated with them that we would recognize today, because yoga really meant meditation. So that's really the number one meaning I think that we lose today, because we tend to think of yoga as stuff we do with the body, making shapes, and meditation as sitting on a cushion. For most of the history of yoga, yoga was meditation. It was the state of deep meditation that arose through the practice of concentration. And it was not a thing that you did, it was the outcome of doing the meditating. So it's, very, very slippery word, very, very hard, as you've heard for the last few moments of me rambling in many different directions, to pin down in any particular place. And that's part of the beauty of studying yoga. Yoga is actually an inquiry. It consists of asking questions, and it consists really of practically trying to explore what those questions mean in our own experience. And any attempt to try and nail down an answer for all time in fixed language is doomed to failure, and also abandons the whole project of inquiring. The aim is not to come up with a permanent answer, except to try to embody that answer in the moment. So that means continuing to inquire and continuing to find the working hypothesis that's viable in this particular instant. And then in a moment, it's gone again. So yoga is a practice. It's an embodied experience of what arises through that practice. It's not something that can just be set in stone and then parroted. Unfortunately, a lot of people do tend to do that, though. They find a text that says a thing that they like, they repeat that, and then pretend that's what they're doing. And that's not really what yoga philosophy or history is there to tell us. It's there to remind us that we've got to think for ourselves, and that all these truths are provisional until we experience them for ourselves.
Well, there's a lot of complexity, and I think that's interesting, because there's so much complexity and diversity across India in general. And then
yes,
you find
absolutely.
that again within the context of yoga. And as you highlighted, there can be two totally opposing meanings of yoga, but then there's also something in between as well, withdrawal of the senses, and then, as you said, concentration and so forth. And I guess as a practitioner, that makes it even more enriching. And, when you look to a text like the Bhagavad Gita, there's so many definitions of yoga, even just in that one text on its own. But I'd love to, you obviously highlighted Patanjali and the definition of yoga in terms of the sutras. So let's talk about the sutras a little bit, because correct me if I'm wrong here, and I'm pretty sure this is something that I uncovered through your book, and that is that there's such an emphasis on the Yoga Sutra and the Bhagavad Gita in terms of study for students and teachers, and in teacher trainings as sort of these really significant, important texts. And of course, they offer so much value to us as practitioners of yoga, but also, that embodiment of yoga in daily life. However, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is these two texts became so heavily emphasized because they were a couple of the very first texts translated to English, and therefore they may actually not be the most relevant to yoga as we know it today, and in terms of how we experience yoga. You can elaborate on that, but I guess the direction I'd love to emphasize here is how there are potentially actually more relevant texts that are that pertain to our practice today, like hatha texts and tantric texts and so forth. So would you mind expanding on that and clarifying that a little bit?
Absolutely, yeah. You are correct there that the Bhagavad Gita was the first text translated from Sanskrit into English in the late 18th century. The Yoga Sutra was translated not long after that in its first version, and there were a number of scholarly translations in the 19th century. There was not so much reverence for the Yoga Sutra among those people who went about the translating as there was for the Bhagavad Gita, which seemed to speak to a deep mystical interest that was alive in Western culture at the same time. The particularly transcendentalist Christians in North America found it riveting. So Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, they talked about reading the Bhagavad Gita as a result of this translation. So I think it crossed over into Western culture very quickly, and seemed to, in some ways, sort of speak the language of the New Testament. And you got God manifest on earth, teaching us all to love each other. It sounds very accessible and I guess directly applicable. The Yoga Sutra is a bit weird, though. It starts to talk about leaving the world behind and shutting everything down, and that doesn't sound so much what the average Westerners up for. So there was quite a lot of critique of what it had to say originally. But it was, I think, largely thanks to Vivekananda. It's a very influential Swami in the late 19th century who visited the United States and elsewhere, but particularly his visit to Chicago in 1893 and his subsequent speaking tour around the US, popularized the Yoga Sutra for a Western audience, used it as a vehicle to talk about his main interest, which was the philosophy of Vedanta, about how all things are one. So he used this text in which everything has to be separated and recognized as being composed of two completely different things that should never be combined. He used that as a tool to talk about how everything is one and can be integrated together. And I think that sowed quite a lot of confusion, because in order to do that, he basically detached the Yoga Sutra from the commentarial history that's always been used to explain it. So other texts have been written by traditional Indian teachers who have unpacked the meaning of the Yoga Sutra, and all of that accumulated knowledge tends to get kicked out of the way in the modern yoga world, because it unfortunately immediately reveals that the Yoga Sutra doesn't say a lot of the things we would like it to. So instead, people just take these little pithy aphorisms that altogether have barely more than 1,000 words in them, and allow them to freestyle and say whatever they feel like, and put Patanjali's name next to it. And that leads really to the idea that Patanjali was teaching some form of postural yoga, which is completely untrue. The only posture he's talking about is sitting still so that you're able to meditate and eventually disappear, really, to have no further interest in engaging with the world. Again, not something that most yoga practitioners are looking to do.
Yeah, can I interject there? So to clarify here, my understanding is that the Yoga Sutras are essentially a text that is more relevant to renunciation, to aesthetics,
Absolutely.
rather than a householder, right?
Yes. So that's, again, why the Gita sounded more relevant. It talks about action in the world. It basically says, the whole idea of renouncing is a delusion. You can't get anywhere that way. You will not get liberated. You're only going to be selling yourself a story that isn't true. So the ultimate truth is, we are acting whether we like it or not. So the question is, how are we going to act? There is a higher wisdom that can guide our actions, and that immediately speaks to people who are living in reality in the 21st century. But people are afraid of the Gita because it's set on a battlefield, so it's basically a pro-war treatise, and it's also got God in it. And a lot of people come to yoga rejecting, monotheistic Western religions. So those two barriers get in the way, whereas the Yoga Sutra sounds like it's speaking very dryly and abstractly about this transformative practice, but it's actually saying the exact opposite. It's saying the sort of things that the Gita is critiquing, that the way to liberation is to cease acting, to shut down the mind and the senses, to disengage from the body, to rest forever in this permanent state of liberated consciousness, which is all very well, but it doesn't really have anything to do with getting on with life. The way to practice what Patanjali is teaching is to go and live in a cave. And perhaps the most sort of recent of the traditional commentators on his text, a guy called Hariharananda Aranya, who lived in Bengal, who's published pretty much the only English language translation of the earliest commentary that goes with the sutras. He was writing in Bengali, but it's been put into English as Yoga Philosophy of Patanjali. If anybody really wants to dig deep, you can find that easily available online to buy. And also you can read it in a PDF at a website called archive.org. And that will leave you in no doubt that it's all about renouncing. And the author of that translation was so convinced that's what it was about that he had himself sealed up in a cave for the last quarter century of his life. So
Wow.
he was pretty convinced that that's what Patanjali was getting at. And so, as you rightly say, that means that really neither of these two texts are really speaking our language necessarily. The Bhagavad Gita is a devotional text. The Yoga Sutra is a renunciate text. they both have a lot of wisdom in them on which we can draw, but it would be probably unlikely that any of us would feel called to follow their teachings to the letter. I think that's actually true of pretty much any ancient Indian text, or even those written in the last few centuries, until we get to the 20th century and the promotion of postural yoga, where you can 100% embody the instructions for making shapes. But largely, this idea of renouncing is the bedrock of yoga traditions. So even those that have a worldlier spin to them, apart from the Bhagavad Gita and one or two other texts, they really emphasize turning away from the world, turning inwards, and finding something transcendent. They don't suggest that that's something you do for 90 minutes a day or once in a while on retreat. They talk about that as a way of life. So the yoga way of life is immediately at odds with what we're thinking. So even when we get medieval Hatha yoga texts like the Hatha Pradipika, it starts by saying you should go and build a hut in the middle of nowhere, not completely removed from society, but certainly on the fringes. Smear it with cow dung to keep out unwanted intruders, and sit there and engage in really intense yoga practice. The practice of the mudras of Hatha yoga supposed to be done, I think, every 3 hours. So, when you're going to get a good night's sleep or have time to eat in between, hiking up all your innards in Uddiyana Bandha, I don't quite know. So it's an intense approach, even in medieval Hatha yoga. So all of these texts, I think, need reframing, whichever we go for, because they were written for a completely different time, in a different culture, with completely different priorities. They were never supposed to be tips on how to, be a bit less stressed in 21st century urban life. And although, people over the centuries in India probably did make use of little tidbits of this information to, take out some of their, conditioning that leads them into more suffering, that's not the way that the yoga texts themselves are written. They had a very specific purpose. They were describing how to liberate yourself once and for all from a cycle of births. And that's largely what you get if you turn to a text about yoga. If you turn to another sort of text that's telling you a story, or perhaps talking about what we might call religious mythology, or texts that are just about other aspects of life, they might include a few tidbits from yoga philosophy that might be very helpful in day-to-day social situations, a bit like the way that Stoic philosophy was most famously written by the Emperor of Rome, and described how he tried to free his mind so that he could execute imperial power more effectively. So there is some of that goes on over the history of yoga, but we don't have access to how that was done because those sorts of people didn't write their own treatises in the same way and call them yoga texts. We have to piece together little snippets that you find elsewhere to see behind the curtain. People must have been doing something yoga-ish here and there in order to get a little bit of respite in life. But what we're coming to yoga today to try and do is new. The idea of actually going quite deep with these traditions, studying what's been written in great detail and depth, and trying to find some way of embodying that. We have to reframe things. It's inevitable. So what we also have to do is admit that and stop this pretense that there is out there some one true yoga text that we can make the blueprint for everything that contains all of the source material. We're innovating all the time. The question is, are we able to do that in a way that's respectful of the traditions that we've tried to engage with, and also in some way authentically channeling at least some of what they were trying to communicate. We don't have to follow it to the letter. Indian traditions have veered right, left, and center off course in all sorts of new directions, contradicting each other and coming up with new things. But especially in this modern era where people are, I think, rightly concerned with being respectful towards other cultures' traditions. I think, if we're going to call something yoga, we need to have some relationship with other things that have been called yoga in the past, while at the same time realizing there's going to have to be a lot of loosening of those bonds. Otherwise, it's impossible to make it applicable today. But coming back to where we started, yes, I think you're right. If we turn to the physical yoga texts, which teach something a bit more recognizably like the practices that we've become more familiar with in the modern era, if we turn to some of the tantric traditions that we're trying to say, there's nothing to renounce, including the body. In fact, all there is the need to engage deeply with the reality of what's happening, and to understand it differently and come to see it from a different perspective. That is very much aligned with what a lot of us are trying to do through yoga practice. So those texts perhaps are a bit more directly applicable, but they will still need reframing.
Yes, for sure. Well, and I mean, Tantra is highly ritualistic and traditionally requires genuine initiation and so forth. But I suppose
Absolutely.
at the heart of it, though, because of that tantric idea of embracing this body and seeing the body as a temple and sort of something to utilize rather than to separate from in terms of
Yes.
identification, it makes it, I think, so much more relevant to the average householder and practitioner of today. There's so much misconception when people hear Tantra.
Sure.
And yet, of course, it's just, I mean, it's very common. People think about sex and things like that, or sensuality, and which is really this commodified thing. But ultimately, when you go in to study Tantra and classical Tantra and the evolutions of Tantra from that, Buddhist Tantra and so forth, and it to me, it seems like the most not only relevant, but the most influential perhaps to how yoga is practiced today. And I could be wrong on that, but that's my perception. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I think you're right. I mean, I think without the influence of Tantra, there would be no interest in yoga in the Western world, because it's through that, as you say, engagement with the body. We could even call it body positivity in a way. The body was regarded as an obstacle by early yoga practitioners. It's the thing that makes us act in the world. We have needs. We also have, therefore, desires. The frustration of our desires causes suffering. The simplest way not to desire things is to shut down the mechanism through which desire works, turn the senses inwards, switch off the mind, never want anything again, never do anything again. That's the simplest way you could characterize early renouncer yoga. And then Tantra comes along and says, well, what are you talking about? You engage with the body. The body's a tool. You can transform the body. You don't have to transcend the body. But you also still need to not be a slave to desire. So even if you're going to open up the field to include the body, desire is still the problem that gets you hooked and leads to you being completely out of control and unable to harness the energy within to see beyond the illusion. Instead, you just get caught up in making your own illusion and trying to feed the needy little greed monster in the head. So that's one way in which it's easy to misunderstand what Tantra is saying. But I think, coming back to where you're pointing with the reference to sex, I don't know why people feel the need to stick the word Tantra on sex positive workshops, because there's no reason to not just enjoy sex and call it sacred without any need to appropriate the term Tantra to go with it. If people really want to dive deep into what a lot of tantric sexual ritual consisted of, they might get a nasty shock, particularly texts that talk about, mixing together sexual fluids and drinking them as an offering to fearsome deities that would otherwise want to eat your flesh. It's not exactly what people are thinking about. A lot of those ideas are recent inventions or drawing on other traditions and mixing them together with some of the ideas that have come from tantric teachings. There are sexual rituals in Tantra. They're just not conscious sex workshop type things.
No.
And so I think that's part of the problem we get with yoga. It's a great metaphor for what happens with yoga. Yoga is used similarly as a label to sell any old junk.
Yeah.
So many things are commoditized, commercialized, marketed with that brand that have absolutely nothing to do with anything that we might recognizably identify as yoga. That's not to suggest we all need to become the yoga police or the Tantra police, but I think if we're going to start using those words, we need to educate ourselves on how they have been used in the past and do our best to have some sort of respectful engagement with that, to the point that we continue to manifest some of that in what we offer. And that's something we can do. That's within our power. It doesn't require us to self-flagellate or pay a load of money to people who are going to teach us how to decolonize our own heads. We can just do that for ourselves by learning and and being respectful. And I think often the engagement with Tantra is entirely appropriative and colonial, and desire to use some other frame to legitimize something that we've got deep shame around in the Western world. There's obviously, a lot of inhibition around sex. Otherwise, those workshops wouldn't flourish.
And I think the issue also is that everything's taken out of context. When we look to that sensual aspect of Tantra and the tantric practices that are associated with that, they're also associated with so many other things like meat eating and using intoxicants and stuff. And it's like, well, yes. Is it really Tantra? And are you really aligning with that particular path of Tantra? Because there are multiple paths in Tantra and many of them don't include this. But it's like, if you're taking that path and you're actually cherry picking something out of it and then, making it something separate. And whereas you're not actually fully, immersing yourself in that. And I find that really an interesting observation. But let's use that as a direction to move into, and we can touch on this very briefly, but onto the chakras. So I've spoken to this a little bit in my community, and I think it's important, and you've done this so nicely and eloquently already, is that, it's not here to say that's good and that's bad, but the chakra system is totally a westernized system as we know it today. And I've actually, perhaps I'm a little bit behind the eight ball, so to speak, but I've actually recently got the book Rainbow Body by Kurt Leland. And yes. So I'm about to start, I've literally just started reading that a couple of days ago. And I think that seems to be such a pivotal book in helping us unpack this timeline of how the chakra system has been taken from India, which this ties back into the start of our conversation, the complexity. There's not one way, there's not one chakra system in India, but it is actually, and there are colors, but it's not a rainbow. And, again, it depends on text and tradition. So maybe you might like to enlighten us on that a little bit.
Well, it's a big topic, but that book is definitely an authoritative overview of what Westerners have done with the idea of chakras, and charting really how basically occultists in the Theosophical Society got fascinated with ways to work with the subtle body, as it's often referred to. These things that you will not find if you dissect a corpse, but that have a role to play in tantric, yogic, transformative practices, often in pursuit of power. Because that's one of the other aspects to Tantra that's not widely discussed when people talk about it in the West. One of its other innovations was to bridge what had previously been a divide between the pursuit of liberation and the pursuit of powers. Now, yoga texts talk about all manner of magic powers that some of us today might struggle to imagine as being, I guess, empirically observable, like becoming invisible or flying or doing all sorts of mind-bending things. But they are staples of most teachings on yoga, and a lot of the more difficult, austere, intense practices that early renouncers went in for were for the purpose of cultivating power. But often, for example, in the Yoga Sutra, it's said, although Patanjali in his third chapter lists, a bucket load of powers, he's got more sutras on powers than pretty much anything else. He says, in the end, if you want to get liberated, you've got to let go of all of that. And the idea that liberation and powers were somehow two alternative routes is quite well established. But Tantra said you can bring these two things together. It's possible to get liberated through the cultivation of power. And actually, that's how we know about Tantra, really. It became a state religion. It became very popular indeed for many centuries in medieval India because it appealed to rulers, because they could empower not only themselves but their kingdoms by chanting the right mantras, installing the right things in the right places, and visualizing correctly, and turning not only their body but the body politic into this kind of divinized, therefore effectively weaponized entity that could go around smiting everybody else. So there's a very secular dimension to the way that Tantra became popular. And this empowering of the body is where chakras fits in, because they are just, ideas really to be installed. They aren't inherent to the body in the way that the modern Western chakra discourse describes them, it's completely at odds with how they were originally presented. The idea that they're somehow sort of present in us, need to be awakened or balanced or harmonized or unblocked or cleansed. There are no ancient tantric texts that talk about them in that way. Instead, there are lots of detailed descriptions of really blueprints for making over the body in a different way. And the ideas inherent in what is symbolized by chakras relate to the elements, relate to deities, relate to sacred syllables associated with elements and deities, relate to locations in the body in which these things need to be visualized in order to transform the body. The whole process of tantric ritual starts basically by demolishing your own body in a visual way through the burning up of this mundane flesh, in your mind at least, not literally. You don't throw yourself in the fire. And then the recreation of the body through the sacred installation of the right things in the right places day after day as a ritual practice. And chakras fit into that worldview as a map of what needs to go in particular places. So they're almost like wall charts in a tattoo parlor for what you need to inscribe on your own system. By chanting the sounds that are encoded in the petals, by visualizing the deity associated with the chakra. And there's all sorts of detailed instructions for how to do that in tantric texts. But as you say, there are different texts that have different numbers, that have different names, that have different locations. And around 100 years ago, a Westerner, a colonial judge in imperial India, who got very interested in tantric religion. He was obviously fascinated by what it was all about and studied deeply. He translated a text from a few centuries earlier, which was a description of a model with 6 chakras. So it's the text, the discourse on the 6 chakras, effectively, is its title, which he rendered into English and borrowed a pen name from various, I guess, Western esoteric sources. He called himself Arthur Avalon, so King Arthur, and this sort of mystical realm of Avalon. So that's in some ways the foundation of a new age way of thinking about all of this. Summed up the ideas there in the chakra nirupana, which itself was representing a model of 6 chakras found in tantric texts, particularly devoted to the goddess Kubjika. And that's where we get the names that we're particularly familiar with. But that's only 6. There's also a 7th at the crown, which creeps in elsewhere through some of the later texts. You see it, for example, in the Shiva Samhita Hatha Yoga text influenced by the Sri Vidya tradition. So there's all sorts of jumbling up of things that goes on. But Arthur Avalon, or Sir John Woodruff, as he was known in his day-to-day life, synthesized all of this into a very accessible format that then became widely referenced, not just in the Western world, but in India. So, for example, B.K.S. Iyengar, in the introduction to Light on Yoga, although he's not interested in chakras, although like Krishnamacharya, his teacher, he's quite disdainful of tantric tradition, he does say, well, if you really want to know about chakras, you should read The Serpent Power by Arthur Avalon. So that's just become this foundational text. These have then become the chakras. And then over subsequent decades, all sorts of ideas have been associated with them, particularly these rainbow colors that, as Kurt Leland explains, have come out of color therapy and all sorts of human potential movement, new age traditions in the last 50 years in the Western world. And now they're everywhere. And you go to India and you see colored chakras with that rainbow symbol. So it's this endless process of things going from west to east, from east to west, backwards and forwards in the history of yoga. And it's very hard to unravel that sort of thing. And it's very hard now then to say what's actually authentic, because the whole idea of imagining things into being is at the foundation of what chakras were used for. Imagination makes it sound in some way derogatory, but it's just harnessing the connection between mind and body to make something manifest. And if people are tuning into the idea that they've got blocked chakras and can unblock them by doing things, that's doing a similar thing. So is it all that different in the end? It's just a completely different blueprint. That's all. It's misleading to suggest that's the ancient Indian idea about chakras. But it works according to a similar mechanism of visualizing something into being. And the placebo effect is very powerful. And therefore, if you think you've unblocked your chakras, you probably have. So It's a very confusing and slippery process when we start to pin down what's empirically real about these things, because they become real in the body. I mean, a force like Kundalini is a perfect case in point. Another idea that's come out of tantric texts, made part of the physical yoga tradition, and has its life of its own in modern yoga and new age circles. That's very hard to define, but people have embodied experiences that are very intense indeed. And I'm not going to tell them they're not real just because the ancient idea of Kundalini involved visualizing it into existence.
And I think it's a similar conversation here in terms of the number of chakras and so forth, as to the auxiliaries or the limbs of yoga as well. So obviously this is a different sort of category or area in yoga, but it's the same thing. We've been told there's a set amount. There's 8 limbs of yoga, and that's what it is.
Yes.
And these are what they are. And and I kind of think, well, I mean, obviously that provides so much value, unpacking those 8 limbs and studying them in depth and applying them, certainly. So it's not to dismiss that. But, as you learn a little bit more about again, coming back to the complexity, we uncover that there's actually more than that, and sometimes many more than that. And sometimes some of the 8 limbs are included and sometimes they're not. So I don't know if you would like to also just elaborate and touch on that as well.
Well, yeah, thank you. I'm currently teaching a course about the Yoga Sutra, which I've sort of subtitled Beyond 8 Limbs, which, if anybody's curious, you can find at truthofyoga.com. The point really being that I don't know how helpful that 8-part framework actually is. I think it confuses people a lot more than it helps them, partly because of the assumption that the third of those elements, the asana component, means vinyasa flow, instead of just sitting still. And as soon as we start to look in more detail at what the Yoga Sutra actually teaches, it's got one principle practice, which is to focus the mind. If you train your mind to focus and get really, really good at focusing, eventually your mind will be able to disappear and then you'll be set free. So the last of those 3, the last 3 of those 8 limbs are all degrees of one-pointed focus, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. And the previous 5 are just preliminary conditions for being able to focus. So you need to sit still, you need to turn your attention inward. And if you have difficulty doing that, pranayama, which basically in that context meant holding the breath for as long as you can in various different ways, is a very good tool for thinning your mind to stop you having the distractions and the volatility that will make it difficult to turn inwards. And then the foundational principles of yama and niyama, they're all geared to being able to let go of life in the world, steady your mind, and be able to turn within. So it's really a concentration practice, and it gets very easily confused with some sort of hierarchy of methods. And if you've just become a bit of a nicer person and you're doing your asana practice diligently, you're 3/8 of the way to samadhi, which is not what Patanjali is talking about at all. So I think we can get very easily confused that way. That said, 8-part frameworks have always been associated with liberation in the traditions that are associated with yoga. The earliest to talk about one was the Buddha. He had his 8-fold path. But the framework that he presents, the 4 noble truths, of which the 4th is the 8-fold path, is exactly the same thing that Patanjali says about suffering in the sadhana part of the 2nd chapter of the Yoga Sutra. We're prone to suffering because we want stuff and we get frustrated because we don't get it all the time. Therefore, the remedy is to change our relationship with the world. Except his remedy for sort of hardcore ascetics is to note that desire arises because we're active in the world. So, stop being active in the world, then you'll be set free. But he doesn't make his Ashtanga yoga the same thing as the Buddha's 8-fold path in that context. He basically says if you practice all of these things, which aren't really all of them practices, you will become capable of discerning the difference between your mind and the true self within. And that's really the aim of the game. And you don't need to do all of those 8 things to do that. You just need to be able to see the difference between the self and the mind. So again, we get very easily confused about what the purpose of yoga is, unless we're focusing on the broader philosophy in Patanjali. But another layer to it all is that Ayurvedic texts are often talking about things in terms of 8 parts. So there is this idea in a way that an 8-part system is healing, and it's the way out of suffering from that point of view. In fact, even the term Ashtanga in Sanskrit, 8 limbs is literally what that means, is a synonym in the Mahabharata and in other texts for the knowledge of Ayurveda, because it's knowing the 8-part things that will help to get you cured. So there is this resonance there. And even today, if you go and talk to modern sadhus in India, the kind of crazy dreadlocked semi-naked dope smokers I was talking about at the beginning, they will still talk about yoga in terms of an 8-part system very often. They might not actually do anything particularly with it, but that has a lot of resonance through yoga tradition. They will explain what they're doing in terms of those particular elements a lot more readily than they will in terms of other limbed systems. So there are particularly in relation to tantric texts, and also therefore some of the physical yoga traditions, 6-limbed systems that are much more I guess associated with what we do actually, and they don't include the word asana for the most part, because asana, even in physical yoga of the medieval era, was not the be all and the end all. It's presented in the Hatha Pradipika as the first step because it makes your body a bit more limber and a bit more capable of doing what you then need to do in the subsequent layers of yoga practice, which involve working with energy and dissolving the mind with that. And in tantric traditions, the idea is it's all about ritual. And sometimes even samadhi, that we've elevated to the sort of pinnacle of the 8-fold path, is not the highest thing. That's the foundation for developing the concentration capacity to then visualize the deity, and to do all of the subtler practices. So yes, you train your mind to be good at focusing, but to do something completely different. And the order of things gets reversed depending on which text you look at. And then there are texts that have way more of these elements, most famously one which has 15, the Aparokshanubhuti, which is in some ways trying to use some of the ideas of Patanjali's system and combine them with the worldview of Advaita Vedanta. So in fact, all of the limbs of yoga are just ways of seeing the oneness that is Brahman through the innermost self. So we're back to yoga means union. It's actually got 15 limbs now instead of 8. So it's ever so slippery, the whole thing. And in the end, I think the key question, which often comes up when I start going on about all this stuff, is why does any of this matter? How does this relate to yoga practice? And the bottom line is, it just helps to either develop your own system where you're pretty confident that you know what you're doing and you've got your own framework that you think is going to lead you out of suffering, or pick one of the many that there have been and try to figure out how that works and study that with somebody who knows what they're talking about in that tradition. But trying to blend together things that come from different systems, it's a recipe for a not very tasty masala of spices. And that's what we're often doing in the modern yoga world without realizing that's what we're doing. So the clearer we become about what we're doing, perhaps the wiser we can get in our selection of flavors, and the better skilled we can become at realizing what suits us and what works with our tendencies and constitution. And hopefully a good teacher will be doing that anyway. But it's very hard to try and go to the left and to the right at the same time. So if you're trying to mix together ideas that come from a worldview where all things are one with things that come from a worldview where everything's separate and needs to be understood that way, it's going to tie your shoelaces together and fall over and land flat on your face. Whereas if you do actually go all the way left and keep turning left, and at the same time, if you were to go in the opposite direction, keep going right, keep turning right, eventually you'll probably end up in a very similar place. But you can't go in both directions at once. So it's helpful to figure out where you're going and try to stick to it.
I find it interesting, actually, that one of the more common auxiliaries or limbs that's mentioned outside of the most famous, let's say, 8 limbs is taka, and that is discrimination and discernment. And
yes.
Isn't that, like, in this conversation, isn't that just highlighting how we need to apply ourselves? And again, it's not emphasizing that something's good, bad, right, or wrong necessarily, but to be able to inquire and to discriminate, to discern, to be able to then move forward with more certainty and clarity, perhaps. Yeah.
Well, I think, inherent in that is actually the opposite of what you just said. There are things that are good and bad. There are things that are right and wrong in terms of where we're trying to go. And there's such a stigma around this word judgment in the modern yoga world. No judgment, which is that's judging, which is not very helpful. And Patanjali, he says that's how you get liberated. This ability to tell the difference, viveka, in his system's terms, very similar though in function to Tarka. It is that capacity to say, to judge something useful or unhelpful. Patanjali says that in terms of the vrittis, they're either afflicted or non-afflicted, and you need to know the difference between them. That's an idea that goes back to the Katha Upanishad, the oldest text that really tells us about yoga, to be able to distinguish between that which is truly beneficial and that which is temporarily gratifying but will leave us hungry again later. So it's like the difference between really nourishing food and fast food that's not gonna sustain us very long. So that has always been part of how yoga works, and we therefore need to see, in the Buddha's language, that which is beneficial because it's leading us out of suffering, and prioritize that, do lots of that, and distinguish it from that which is harmful, leading us deeper into suffering and more confusion. Try to do a lot less of that and to stop manifesting that in our relationship with others. And that's really what the Bhagavad Gita was getting at when it used this phrase skill in action. It's very much borrowing the language of the Buddha's teachings, probably consciously, probably because the Hindu tradition was trying to, or what we now know of as Hinduism, the Brahminical priestly tradition was trying to stage a rearguard action against the popularity of some of these renouncer ideas, particularly the Buddhist ones. And so it says, no, you can do all of that within this bigger picture context of what you're previously familiar with. But we've reinvented it all. So skill in action is what the Buddha was talking about in that way. What is helpful, what is unhelpful. So we need to continually discern between those things, which means we need to have some kind of orientation. We need a map and we need a sense of direction. And we get those from looking at old yoga texts. But as I said, they're probably not going to be the blueprints for where we're trying to go. So we need to ask ourselves honestly, what am I trying to do here? Why? and then see how that compares to what old texts have said about what they're all for and why. And we'll have to try to map somehow some of that onto what we're doing, but we'll need our own sense of where we're aiming. And hopefully our teachers are providing us with that. But often these days, that's not the case. So we might need to do our own reading and our own thinking and ask ourselves honestly about that. Once we've got some kind of a framework, it's possible to say, am I doing something that's conducive to benefit, or am I getting in the way of myself and causing myself unnecessary problems here? And the simplest model, to go right back to basics, is to do with suffering. All of these traditions arose from a desire to remove the problem of suffering. We might not share the way that was defined 2,500 years ago. We might not see the biggest problem in life as being to escape a cycle of births. We might instead just be looking for a little bit more peace despite the chaos around us in the modern world. That's okay. The connecting thread of suffering is still there. We can then still borrow the framework and just come up with a model that tries to analyze, am I removing the causes of that suffering in me and in my conduct in relation to others, or am I strengthening those causes? Then we've got a simple binary, but that requires us again to start engaging with the thing that most people in the modern yoga world don't want to talk about: duality. The fact that there is a polarity between things, and including right and wrong, and somewhere on a spectrum between those extremes, we will find ourselves. And we just need to say, am I sliding towards one extreme or trying to orient myself a bit more towards the other one? And if we can do that, then we've got a workable framework that is yoga philosophy that we can then practically engage with and do something with. And it is still aligned in some way with the basic, architecture of what yoga traditions have always been about, but it will be a new spin on them, and it would be madness to claim that new model is Patanjali's yoga, as a lot of people would like to do when they write a new version of how we live yoga in the 21st century. Unless we're being celibate and cultivating disgust for the body, we're not being true to Patanjali's description of yamas and niyamas.
That's a very middle path approach, which makes so much sense. And it's about embracing the innovation of yoga in terms of how it plays out in the context of life today, whilst retaining the essence and respecting, the essence of these teachings. And look, there's so much complexity, of course, and I appreciate something that you've raised on your podcast. What is tradition? What does that even mean?
Yeah.
And that in itself is a whole can of worms, which is so great. I love these inquiries that you often propose, and everything keeps coming back to another question, which seems
Yes.
so relevant and important anyway. But I'd love to use this as a bit of a segue. We might really close up this conversation, because I'd love to direct the listener to the work that you're doing as well as your book. But you're obviously offering online courses, and I think you've got maybe a retreat coming up. Would you like to speak to what you've got going on?
Oh, thank you. Yes. Well, out of the book grew a course that I entitled The Truth of Yoga. I had the misfortune to bring out a book right in the midst of a pandemic, with people locked down and able to travel. And I had to do everything online at that time. So I had been teaching online courses for a few years, so I was geared up for that. But what I had hoped to do at the time that my book came out was to travel around the world, giving workshops, talking about these ideas, and perhaps turn that into a longer form retreat at some point, which I am now finally doing this summer here in the UK, and hoping to take that on the road in future. So if you're listening, finding this stuff interesting, and would like to spend a few days not just talking about ideas, but actually trying to embody them, and seeing how theory and practice relate to each other, please do get in touch and we'll see what we can do. For now, though, my main offering has been the development of a series of online courses. One that is called The Truth of Yoga, which does basically develop the ideas in the book into a simple overview, and quite a few teacher trainings are now plugging that into what they offer as a 12-hour foundational introduction to yoga history and philosophy. And then
Great.
I zoom in to do Q&A sessions with people to, I guess, unpack some of the stuff that remains, because a lot of questions arise from that kind of helicopter view of how much has changed over the last 2,500 years. But then also to drill down into the main text. So although we've identified quite rightly that there are reasons to be questioning whether the Bhagavad Gita, the Yoga Sutra are the best places to start, they are the places that most people start. And yoga teachers talk about them so much that we need to know what they say. So I've got a course on each of those, which drills down into pretty much verse by verse. Certainly in the Yoga Sutra we look at all but 2 sutras, I think, and the Gita most of the verses of all 18 chapters, and try to unpack them in a useful framework that makes sense, that means that you can talk knowledgeably about what's in this text, and also understand how it's different perhaps to what you might be doing in a modern yoga context, but perhaps still able to find a way of building a bridge between those 2 things. And then similarly with the Upanishads and the Hatha Pradipika, the Upanishads really being the source of all Indian tradition in a way. When it comes to these ideas, they're certainly the first place that people talked about there being a problem of suffering relating to a cycle of births, the need therefore to get liberated from that problem, and the association of that with action and desire, and that's articulated in the oldest of the Upanishads. So looking at where these ideas come from, I think, can help us to really go back to basics, first principles, come up with a list of our own bullet points of these are the key things that need to be there in what I'm doing, and then we're free perhaps to just run with it and see what evolves from there in our own sense of what's helpful to us here today. And that's what yoga teachers have done throughout history. They haven't felt constrained by the sense they shouldn't innovate. They just haven't admitted to innovating. And that's the problem we face. So I developed a course at the start of this year for the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, really looking at, I call it the roots of modern yoga, to see just how much innovation took place in the last 150 years, without which none of us probably would be practicing yoga, because it just wouldn't sound appealing. It would just sound either completely other or 180 degrees opposite to what we're trying to do in our lives. But because of this sort of cultivation of a physical way in, which really only took shape in the last 150 years, particularly sequence postures as the foundation of classes, and that's really quite new. And understanding that, I think, frees us up to think that innovation isn't a bad thing. It doesn't have to be old to be authentic, but that doesn't mean we can do whatever we like and call it yoga. We need to actually look at what some of those key innovators did, and to see how concerned they were with appearing to be consistent with tradition, even though they'd completely ripped up what went before them and remixed it into a whole new thing. They were still trying to do that in a way that was respectful of some of the foundational principles of earlier traditions. So we can learn a lot from that. So that's another of my courses. I'll continue developing online courses because I enjoy them, and it's fun to be able to do what we're doing here, connecting across continents, halfway around the world in a way that people just didn't do even 5 years ago. I'm sure there were podcasts, sure people gave interviews. I had Skype conversations with people, but this has now become so normal. It's possible to dial into a learning platform. And even if you can't be there at the same time as each other, because it's impossible to pick a time that works for the East Coast of Australia and the West Coast of the United States. But nonetheless, we can all come in at slightly different times, and it works one week for one group and another week for another. So I think there's a lot to be gained from online study, but it can't replace being together in person. And there's something that develops in that context, which is very hard to do online, which is actually to just sit down and not say anything, be together and see what actually is of interest to the people in the room right then. So to not go with an agenda of like, I want to talk, this is what I'm going to say. A bit like this podcast. I had, some idea of what we might cover, but I didn't know what questions you were going to ask me. I didn't know what I was going to say. And the most interesting things arise in that way, because I want to keep learning. I learn from people asking good questions that make me go to my bookshelf and look stuff up, or realize that I need to talk to somebody else who's more knowledgeable than me about something and find out from them. That's how I got started on the process that led to writing the book, trying to answer people's difficult questions. And when we're all together in that way, that becomes an organic process. And, it really does seed a different approach to learning. And if that's also allied to trying to get somewhere with practice, I think it's very enriching indeed. That's what develops yoga practice. That's how I got fascinated with yoga myself, by spending time with teachers in that kind of a way. And now that things are a bit more fluid again in the possibility of travel, I'm keen to dive back in and do some of that myself.
Yeah, great. And so for the listener, you obviously have your podcast, which is Ancient Futures. And do you want to share your Instagram? I mean, you've got one Instagram handle for you and also for your book, if you'd like to share those.
At some point I need to tidy up my online presence because I'm spraying in too many different directions, I think. But I have a website, truthofyoga.com, where you can find out all about the courses. And I therefore have an Instagram allied to that, at Truth of Yoga. I have my own personal website, danielsimpson.info, which was where I used to put all my writing. And then my own Instagram, Daniel C. Simpson. And then you can find me at ancientfutures.substack.com, which is the place where I've been putting out my podcast, as well as some other writing that's been developing recently as I work on a new book. And that's all coming together. But hopefully at some point I'll find a way of making it all live under one address so that I don't go crazy trying to update 5 different things at once.
Well, I'll make sure that we linked everything in the podcast show notes, so it'll be nice and easy for everybody. And just in closing, it's interesting because, again, I just want to reiterate that, particularly your work, but your book, but all of your work really helps. There's an authority and a credibility there because it is anchored in academic knowledge and research, but it's offered in a way that it is accessible rather than intimidating for the average person. And I think that this is really important because it's the bridge to educating and informing the yoga community at large, to information and insight about yoga, so that we can continue to uphold respectfully the essence of yoga in the best way possible as we continue to evolve and as we continue to embrace innovation. And so I really appreciate your work and everything that you share, and really enjoy conversations on your podcast. Just want to really recommend all of your work to everybody listening in. So thank you so much for the work and your contribution in this field.
Oh, thank you. It's a real pleasure to come together and chat. And I should salute you for your knowledge and your commitment to sharing, authentic and well-researched information with those who are tuning into your podcast, but also those who you're teaching. It's really inspiring to see how many people now are actually interested in diving perhaps even a lot deeper than where I'm going. People who want to do what I've done, go and do master's degrees, maybe even go on and do PhDs, become yoga academics themselves. And there's absolutely no need to do that as a yoga practitioner to learn something, that's reliable about yoga history and philosophy. But there is, a thirst for knowledge out there. And I really appreciate the way that you bring that forward, and the questions you ask, and the comments you share yourself online. So thank you for inviting me to come and share that conversation with you directly, rather than just typing it out on my phone.
Of course. No, it's been such an enjoyable conversation. And, again, bringing the academic kind of intensity and depth, the intellectual side of things, to the mainstream, I think is really, really important. And as you said, it is becoming more and more popular. And I'm not an academic. I don't think I ever will be, but I feel like I'm really called to digging into that sort of level of research and decoding it and trying to understand it at my own personal level. But that's, what has particularly helped me resonate with you, and the way you have conveyed and communicated it without diluting and without extracting anything out. You've got it all there, but it's easy to assimilate for the average mind like mine, and in a way that I can then also share that with others. So, but Daniel, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I'm so grateful for your time and your flexibility in making this work. So, and I look forward to seeing the new book. That's very exciting, and what you've got coming up soon. So, all the best, and we'll keep in touch.
Thank you. All the best to you too. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
If this episode was of value to you and your life, please subscribe. And if you can think of someone who would benefit from this dialogue, please do them a favor and send it their way. If you feel called, hop on over to iTunes and leave a 5-star review. This is the best way to get these conversations into the ears and hearts of our wider community, to those who need it most. You can find me at amyelandry.com or over on Instagram at amyelandry. May we all move a little closer to a life living in alignment.